If you read the title of this video, you might wonder why I say that the Loxjie P20 is basic. It's rather simple, really. The P20 is cheap, or more politely said, a more affordable hybrid solid-state/tube headphone amplifier. A few reviewers hyped this product last year and recommended it. And on its face, the P20 looks like a stunning bargain, doesn't it? You get a fairly powerful amplifier capable of driving 300 ohm headphones. You can roll tubes for slightly modifying the sound. You get balanced inputs and a balanced output, a digital display to monitor input, output, and volume, and an all-metal construction. For $100, the P20 looks very impressive. But the problem with the P20 is that you don't really get what you expect. The $100 is a ticket to enter the theater, but you still have to pay more for the soda and popcorn. I've had the P20 for about 6 months. Like many of you, I saw a certain reviewer's glowing comments about the product and was intrigued. I have to admit, Loxjie does try hard to bring you as much quality as it can for a head-smackingly low price. The P20 is built really well. Some people might argue that Chinese audio gear is cheaply built and unreliable, and that was certainly the case several years ago. But times have changed and Chinese companies easily compete with the well-known brands in both build and features. The P20 itself is physically faultless. I was surprised by its sturdy casing and unpretentious design. A lot of companies make products with aluminum housings and then cheap out with the volume knob and use plastic instead of metal. I was therefore pleasantly surprised to find that the P20's knob is the same metal as the rest of the unit. It turns with clicks, and each click is 1 unit of volume adjustment. Moreover, if you stop listening and turn off the P20, the next time you turn it back on, the amp will be at the same volume that you last used. The LCD screen is bright and useful. Press the volume button and you can switch between the RCA and balanced input. Press again and you can activate the balanced output. The screen is responsive and does not show any lag. The P20 comes with a pair of 6N3 tubes. These are Chinese tubes that are cheaply made. There's 2 things surprising about them. First, the tubes exhibit very little hiss with standard impedance headphones. And second, the tubes have very little tube sound. The tube discussion is long and tedious. Ask audiophiles and they will tell you any number of things. They might say that tubes affect the sound slightly, or that tubes affect the sound considerably, or that a particular manufacturer of tubes has a tube tuned to a certain sound character. Others will say that you cannot actually tune a tube. What is probably universally accepted is that tubes change the timbre of the music and had harmonic distortion. Timbre is the unique sound of a particular instrument or, say, a singer. For example, an acoustic guitar playing a note sounds vastly different from an electric guitar playing the same note. If you change the sound of the acoustic guitar slightly, you color the sound, you then therefore change the timbre. Harmonic distortion is, well, distortion that people tend to find pleasing. That's the whole point of having a tube amplifier, so you can get that tubey sound. The stock tubes for the P20 don't add much to the tube experience. The timbre seems just slightly different when compared to another $100 amplifier, which is the Monolith Liquid Spark. Also, the stock tubes don't exhibit much harmonic distortion. There is a difference between the Liquid Spark and the P20 with stock tubes, but just not enough to claim that the P20 is a real tube amplifier. This brings us to the sound of the P20 in general. I went back and forth between the P20 and the Liquid Spark. I used my Sennheiser HD6XX and played music through Amazon Music HD. Both amps were connected to the Shit Modi 2 via RCA. I tried to volume match. The P20 does have slightly more emphasis in the bass. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass is totally lost when compared to the Liquid Spark. In other words, where the Liquid Spark may provide some detail amongst bass instruments, the P20 will tend to meld them all together. The P20's bass emphasis also bleeds into the mids, giving the mids a thicker, more intimate sound. The Liquid Spark, in comparison, has a more detailed, more natural representation of the mids. The P20's presentation of treble is slightly different from the Liquid Spark. The P20, for example, has a very slight treble boost, whereas the Liquid Spark stays neutral in comparison. This was most obvious in John Williams' Scherzo for X-Wings. The P20 accentuated the horns. The Liquid Spark had a smoother representation. These differences are sometimes noticeable and sometimes not. The problem with the P20 is that it sounds far too much like a solid-state amplifier. Yes, it has some tube signatures, but not often enough, and certainly not to the extent needed to justify the tube integration. This left me a little curious. I read online that the P20's power supply died for some people. Others claimed that the power supply was not providing the rated power to the P20. The P20 comes with a 12-volt 1.67 amp power supply. I tested my HD660S and 6XX using the standard power supply. I noticed that the drivers on both headphones sounded a bit loose. The best way I can describe it is by saying that the drivers were not performing at their peak. The bass sounded muddy and vocals lacked clarity. It was certainly possible that my power supply was not performing as required. Consequently, I reached out to hifi and asked if they had a power supply that might fit the P20. hifi let me borrow their iPower X power supply. I asked for the 15-volt, 1.5 amp version. The slightly higher voltage should not cause any issues for the P20, or so I had assumed. The iPower X is supposed to cancel out noise generated through your power outlet or surge protector. Frankly, I'm not the type to buy into these kinds of claims. I know some audiophiles swear that an expensive power supply makes a huge difference. I am not one of those people. All I wanted was a power supply that might help me test my hypothesis, that the P20's stock power supply is just plain old bad. I then also decided to buy replacement tubes for the stock 6N3. I wasn't inclined to spend a lot of money tube rolling, and finally chose matched pairs from Riverstone Audio. And I also purchased socket savers to test. I made the upgrades. I plugged in the hifi power supply and tested the new tubes, both with and without the socket savers. The socket savers made no sonic changes to the setup at all. The iPower X was a noticeable improvement from the stock power supply. Both the HD660S and 6XX had tighter bass and more detail than with the stock power unit from Loxjie. Mind you, I am not advocating that people buy expensive power supplies for their audio gear. Instead, I am merely pointing out that the Loxjie power supply is bad. It prevents the P20 from doing its job effectively. I can verify that the complaints regarding the P20 power supply are justified. The hifi power supply worked perfectly. I wouldn't buy anything more expensive than the hifi. However, I would be cautious about buying another Chinese power supply off Amazon or eBay. It is very hard to tell if those power supplies have been properly tested, and many of the compatible units look nearly identical to the one that Loxjie includes in the packaging. It is entirely possible that they are exactly the same thing, just rebranded. Consequently, in this circumstance, I recommend spending a little bit more money to get the hifi power supply or something similar. Whereas the stock tubes provided little differentiation from the Liquid Spark, the Riverstone replacements were a noticeable change. The Riverstone tubes provide longer bass reverberation than the stock tubes. The Riverstone tubes provided slightly better separation between sub-bass and mid-bass, and there is a greater bass slam. The bass overall sounds tighter and has more impact than it did with the stock tubes. The mids have a little more clarity with the Riverstone tubes. The bass still bleeds into the mids with the Riverstone, but that cannot be helped. Vocals had a slight amount of grain, which I think added some depth to the songs. Whether I listened to male or female vocals, hip-hop, folk, or pop, the vocals all sounded intimate. Treble sounds about the same between the two tube types. The treble is slightly elevated compared to the Liquid Spark. It did not get sibilant or harsh at any point when paired to the 660S or the 6XX. When I compared the Riverstone tubes to the Liquid Spark, I immediately noticed the alterations from the tubes. The Liquid Spark sounded airier, provided better separation of instruments, and an overall more neutral, cleaner sound. But that should be expected. Indeed, on the HD660S and 6XX, the differences between the amplifiers provided considerably different experiences from the same songs. The Sennheiser headphones are excellent in their own right, but paired with a good tube amplifier, they become slightly more intimate and soothing. Pair them to a solid-state amplifier and you get more detail, greater soundstage, and more neutral signature. This was true when I tested the upgraded P20 to the Liquid Spark. I can say that the Riverstone tubes provide more of that tube sound you would expect than the stock tubes do. In fact, my initial impression was that the P20 didn't sound like a tube amplifier, but the tube rolling demonstrates the fault lay in the stock tubes and not with the amplifier itself. The Riverstone tubes exhibited a lot of noticeable hiss initially. I took them and the socket savers out and reseated everything. I let the tubes warm up for about 15 minutes and listened again. I think reseating helped because the hiss was reduced considerably and hardly noticeable. This, unfortunately, is a big problem you will run into when purchasing 6N3 tubes. These are very cheaply made and tend to have significant noise. You could bend over backwards finding a much better set of tubes, but you'll end up spending a lot more money. And at some point, when the accessories start costing more than the actual product, you just need to stop. Is the P20 a replacement for the Darkvoice 336? No, not at all. The Darkvoice is a beast which provides much more power and is a true OTL amplifier. Moreover, you have a wider selection of tubes for the Darkvoice than you do for the P20. One thing both units share in common is the terrible Chinese tubes that come standard. The stock tubes on the Darkvoice make everything sound tinny, and as I mentioned already, the P20 stock tubes add very little tube character. You must also keep in mind that headphone matching is paramount. Not every pair of headphones will sound good on tube amplifiers, or even a hybrid amplifier like the P20. Sennheiser's HD600, 650, and 660S perform exceedingly well with all types of amplifiers. Audeze headphones, on the other hand, do not. I think if you want to experience tube sound from the P20, you have to invest in a pair of headphones known for complementing a good tube amplifier. My first and foremost recommendation, therefore, would be the Sennheiser HD600 series. Assuming you have a pair of headphones you like and will actually pair well with a tube amplifier, the next issue will be upgrading the P20. And upgrade you must. As I said, the stock tubes are holding back the P20's abilities, but so is the lame duck power supply. Both elements, I am sure you will agree, are rather important. If you choose to buy the P20, then set aside some money for a power supply and tube rolling. Now, you don't need to buy socket savers, but those are cheap accessories anyway. The Riverstone tubes are about $50. The iPower X is $100. The socket savers are a measly $11. You're looking at an additional $161 for these three accessories. And of course, the P20 is $100. Your total cost is $261, not including taxes and shipping. It is safe to say that you're actually going to end up paying about $300 out the door. I point all of this out because I think the P20 is in fact a basic start. It's a starter hybrid tube amp into which you can sink a lot of money. Even without the socket savers, the replacement tubes and power supply cost more than the P20 itself. You have to ask yourself if this is the path you want to take. Is it worth to upgrade? If so, then why not simply buy the Darkvoice 336, which is not much more expensive than the upgraded P20 that I have? Well, there are several reasons why the P20 might make more sense than the Darkvoice. First, the Darkvoice is a big beast. It's heavy, bulky, gets hot very fast, and is overkill for standard impedance headphones. Second, the P20 is compact, but provides plenty of power for even high impedance headphones like the HD6XX. Third, the P20 provides a slightly colored sound out of the box, without upgrades. You can choose to upgrade at your leisure. Yes, the P20 can in fact sound better with replacement components, but its stock configuration is still a powerful amplifier that doesn't have noise. Fourth, the P20's hybrid design means that you can use many more headphones than you can with an OTL amp like the Darkvoice. Audeze, Focal, Hi-Fi Man, Sony, Beyerdynamic, all these headphones will play more nicely with the P20 than they will with the Darkvoice. You will notice I have not mentioned the P20's balanced topography yet, and that is because I am tired of this gimmick. I have seen too many tube amplifiers with balanced input and output. I have not heard any justification for this. Why use a balanced input if your tubes are going to add distortion anyway? Moreover, as I have said repeatedly, modern DACs have no audible noise whatsoever. Forcing balanced connection into something like the P20 is fanboy service and nothing more. The balanced output of the P20 does not provide more power than the single-ended. The single-ended sounds just like the balanced. There is literally no audible difference. Now, I'm sure someone will argue I'm wrong and they can hear a difference from balanced connection, but I tell you from experience using a vast number of gear, when power is not an issue, balanced connection has not once provided a better listening experience to me on any piece of gear, ever. But I have to give credit where credit is due. Loxjie did implement a fully balanced design. In something as cheap as the P20, that should be recognized. Unfortunately, the balanced topography doesn't add anything to the experience, but neither does it take anything away. Here's the thing. The P20 is a good product. Those who have never purchased a tube amplifier before might want to approach the field with caution. Spending $250 on the Darkvoice might be a big leap for some. The P20 needs improvement. Loxjie's power supply is laughable. When I notice the difference, that's a huge problem. I am stringently against power supply upgrade-itis. To me, it is nearly as dumb as buying $300 cables. So, when I tell you that the power supply needs an upgrade, rest assured the power supply definitely needs an upgrade. Hifi's claim that the iPower X will reduce noise is dubious. I had the P20 plugged into a cheap surge protector that powers my laptop, 2 monitors, the Modi, Liquid Spark, and my Tivoli speakers. I didn't hear any noise reduce when I switched power supplies back and forth. I'm not surprised that the stock tubes sound nothing like real tubes. In this price range, I cannot reasonably expect a company to methodically select tubes. Bolari is an exception, but their tube amplifier also costs double. These are the only tube gripes I have with the P20. After 6 months, this is all I could find. And if you've been watching my channel regularly, it should be bloody clear I do not hold back negative reviews. So, if I can't find anything else to complain about, that should tell you something about the P20. You could spend a lot of time messing around with the tubes. You can decide to upgrade the power supply eventually. But if you do, be confident that the P20 will perform better than it does directly from Loxjie's hands. And that's the biggest reason why I think that the P20 is a great starter tube amplifier. It sounds good out of the box, but it sounds really good if you get the right tubes and the right power supply. If you are contemplating buying a tube amplifier, I think you should start here with the P20. Skip the knob sound and little dot offerings, go directly to the P20. Upgrade its components when you feel ready. In short, the Loxjie P20 is an excellent basic starter package that requires some TLC. You have to put in more money to get the most out of it. But if you're committed to the tube world, then the P20 is a very good option that leaves room for you to experiment. In the future, I will compare my upgraded Loxjie P20 to the Bolari HA540 Mark II. And that should be an interesting contest. Look for that video in a few weeks.